Hi, welcome to my bedroom. That's a little weird if we haven't been introduced yet. If we haven't met yet, I'm Elizabeth, the literary travel blogger and vlogger behind A Suitcase Full of Books. And because I haven't been traveling recently, I started redecorating my bedroom with a travel theme. So I just put a map over the bed, and I want to add stickers to where I've been. And I thought while I do it, I will chat with you about the books that have taken me to places around the world. Travel has always been a huge part of my life, so I actually have been to more countries than I'm going to mark on the map because I'm going to just start with 2015, which is when I started the blog. So in 2015, I decided to take a literary-inspired trip to England. So I called up my mom and asked her if she wanted to go because my mom and I were in a mother-daughter book club when I was younger, so I thought she might be interested, and then my partner decided to join us too. And so we flew to England, where we spent the first week in London because there are so many literary sites to see. So I had a bunch of childhood favorites like Paddington, Peter Pan, Sherlock Holmes, Harry Potter, and maybe not a favorite, but when in London, Shakespeare. And we started with the Paddington Bear statue, and then the Peter Pan statue, and then the Sherlock Holmes Museum, and then, of course, Shakespeare's Globe. And when in London, I couldn't not go see the Harry Potter experience. After London, we headed south to Dorset because what I really wanted to see on that trip was Corfe Castle. My favorite childhood books are The Famous Five by Enid Blyton. I don't know if a US audience is familiar with these. I'm not sure they're sold in the US even. But my mom has a friend who lived in Australia and had the series, and she lent them to me, and I just fell in love with them. So they're about 4 kids and a dog, and one of the children owns an island, and the island has castle ruins on it. And I don't remember when I found out that Corfe Castle is actually the inspiration for that setting, but I knew I had to see it someday. So we headed down to Dorset, and we stayed in Swanage, and we took the little steam train from Swanage over to Corfe, and went to see Corfe Castle, which turns out is not on an island. And while I was there in one of the bookstores in town, I actually found this book, which is Enid Blyton and Her Enchantment with Dorset, and I read it really quickly, which is good because it turns out that there's a lot more to see in the area that Blyton turned into exciting settings in her book, like quarry caves turned into smugglers' caves. I was also reading Bill Bryson's Notes from a Small Island at the time, and if you're familiar with Bill Bryson, he kind of complains his way around the country, but in a really funny way, and Dorset was the only place in the book that he had absolutely nothing to complain about because it really is that gorgeous. So if you can get there, I highly recommend it. After I returned home from England, I started the blog, and so I started to think about other places I could go that are inspired by the books I'd read, and the first place I thought of was Green Gables. Is Prince Edward Island really as pretty as Anne of Green Gables makes it out to be? So in 2016, I headed to Canada to find out. The answer is yes. Yes, it is. In Prince Edward Island, there are several Anne sites and places related to the author. Not only Green Gables Heritage Place, there's the author's birth house, the Anne Museum, Avonlea Village. The food is amazing. I really want to go back for a lobster dinner. And the people are just as nice as you would think based on the book. From Prince Edward Island, my partner and I flew back to the United States to Virginia because my aunt had invited us to spend my birthday in Chincoteague. I was familiar with Chincoteague because of the book Misty of Chincoteague. If you're not familiar with the book, it's based on an annual festival that happens every year called pony penning. The wild ponies that live on Assateague Island are rounded up once a year, and some of the foals are auctioned off for 2 reasons. Number 1, to keep the head of horse on the island to the required 150. And number 2, to raise money for the volunteer fire department. I was really excited to experience the festival, and we even stayed in the inn where Marguerite Henry, the author of Misty of Chincoteague, started writing the book. The next trip I took that year was to Holland. My mom had a conference to go to, so I tagged along, and while she was in her conference, I went and explored. So one of the books we had read in our mother-daughter book club years ago was Girl in Hyacinth Blue. This book made me fall in love with Vermeer's paintings. Vermeer lived and painted in Delft, so I took the train to Delft and went to see the Vermeer Museum, and while I walked around Delft, I listened to A Girl with a Pearl Earring, which is based on one of his famous paintings. While I was in Holland, I also wanted to go somewhere that had windmills and wooden clogs because as a child I had read Wheel on the School. It's a really cute book. So I found a historic village to go to, Zaanstans, and it had all the sort of quintessential Dutch village stuff. And of course, when in Amsterdam, reread Anne Frank's diary before going to the Anne Frank house. So that takes us to 2017. In 2017, I signed up for the Open Palace program, which is a museum intensive course, and it took us in a loop around southern England. It started in Bath. From there we went to Stonehenge, then Brighton, then Windsor, then Oxford, then Stowe, then Woburn, and then London. While the classes were really interesting, we did have some free time in each place, and so I spent my free time visiting the literary sites of each place. When in Bath, I think it's a requirement to read Jane Austen, so I took Northanger Abbey with me. And then when we moved on to Brighton, I learned about the connection between Brighton and Jane Austen's unfinished novel Sanditon, so I picked this up while I was there and read it on the train. And then in Oxford, of course, I had to go eat at the Eagle and the Child, which is the pub where the Inklings met, which is Tolkien's group, which included C.S. Lewis, and I also had just enough time to take a walking tour to some of the locations around Oxford related to Tolkien, C.S. Lewis, and also a Harry Potter filming location, so that was cool.
My father and I have a bet, you see. I don't think you're going to last 10 minutes in this tournament. He disagrees. He thinks you won't last far.
When we went to Windsor, I actually didn't have any literary plans, but I was on the tour, and I went to see Queen Mary's Dollhouse, and it turns out, fascinatingly, that Queen Mary's Dollhouse has a library in which authors of the time were commissioned to create new works specifically for the library. So, for example, one of the authors was Arthur Conan Doyle, and he wrote How Watson Learned the Trick, and this is a replica of the book that's in the library. The Open Palace program ended back in London, and of course, this time in London, I had to go see the Dickens Museum because I hadn't seen it before, and David Copperfield is one of my favorite books, and turns out that David Copperfield and his author do have a lot in common. So then I had a friend fly in, and I dragged her to a bunch of literary places. I hope she's forgiven me by now. So we went to Chawton, which is where the Jane Austen House Museum is, and nearby is Winchester. And in Winchester, not only can you find Jane Austen's grave, but you can also find King Arthur's table mounted on a wall. After Winchester, we headed up to Leicester because of this monstrosity. This monster is The Soon in Splendor by Sharon K. Penman. It's about the King Richard III. It's an amazing book, and it's because of this book that I was following closely when the story about his bones being found in a car park broke.
When archaeologists began searching this Leicester car park, they described the dig as a long shot. But just weeks into the excavation, they made the most extraordinary discovery: a body. Today, the identity of that skeleton was made official.
Beyond reasonable doubt, the individual exhumed at Greyfriars in September 2012 is indeed Richard III, the last Plantagenet King of England.
I wanted to go see the new museum in Leicester. So after the King in the Car Park, Richard was reinterred in the cathedral in Leicester, and a new museum was built over the excavation site. And the entire downstairs is about the medieval history of King Richard, and the entire upstairs is about the excavation and the new technology that they use for DNA testing and to gather data, and it was really fascinating, and I'm actually really glad that I went. So that takes us to 2018, in which I did relatively little travel. I did get to New York, where I went to the public library, of course, but it was because I wanted to see Pooh Bear. I love Pooh Bear, but the original stuffed animal Pooh Bear and his friends are at the New York Public Library in the children's room. Turns out that Christopher Robin banished them to the United States and sadly wanted nothing to do with them, so there they sit. Other than that, I didn't do a whole lot of travel. I did go to Travelcon in 2018, which took me to Austin, Texas. And it was there that I learned about the author O. Henry, and I went to the O. Henry house.
My characters are very similar to that people I know.
Other than that, 2018 was a little quiet, and we move on to 2019. 2019 was a pretty big travel year. It started with a trip down the Oregon coast to the Sylvia Beach Hotel. Sylvia Beach was actually the owner of Shakespeare & Company, the bookstore that I would really love to visit in Paris, but in Newport, Oregon, there's a hotel run by two women, and every single room is themed for a different author. It was so cool, and I got to stay in the Harry Potter room. I solemnly swear I'm up to no good. And while I was in Newport, I was in one of the shops and I found this book, which is Murder at Yakina Head by Ron Laval. He is a local author and he has written a series of cozy mysteries that take place in and around the area. And one of the places I had hoped to visit is the lighthouse. Unfortunately, it was closed on the day we wanted to go. But the book was a fun vacation read. So the next trip I took that year was again to Travelcon, and this time it was in Boston, which was awesome because there was a lot of literary sites that I really wanted to hit in and around Boston, which, of course, if you get to Boston, you have to go visit the ducklings in the garden and, you know, take this huge book with you because that's what normal people do. And then I also spent some time learning about the author of the very famous poem Paul Revere's Ride, and I did a whole video about following in the footsteps of the author, Longfellow. And then I made my way to Concord. And in Concord, I finally got to see the real house of the Little Women, Louisa May Alcott's family home, and where she wrote Little Women. And while there, of course, you can't go to Concord without going to Walden Pond. So I walked in the footsteps of Thoreau, and it turns out that Walden is not the serene place it used to be. And also the home of Nathaniel Hawthorne. And he actually lived in a house called the Old Manse and has written Mosses from an Old Manse. After that came the big trip of the year, and that was to Myanmar. On the way to Myanmar, I stopped in Bangkok, but I was too busy reading Burmese Days by George Orwell, so I didn't end up finding a book to go to Bangkok with. So if you have a suggestion, let me know. And once in Myanmar, I then also tried to find a less Western author to read, and I ended up starting to read The Glass Palace. And the reason I was in Myanmar was to travel with YouTubers Kara and Nate, and if you haven't, checked out the 2 videos on that trip. And then on the way home from Myanmar, I made a stop in Tokyo, and I read Strange Weather in Tokyo. It's kind of a weird book, don't know if I'd recommend it. And that brought me home, where I've been ever since. So while I'm home, I am planning to share more about Alaska literature, like A Wolf Called Romeo. And if you haven't watched my most recent video that includes this book, you should, because my new puppy makes a debut. And I hope that you found some reading inspiration along the way, and let me know what you're planning to read and where it's gonna take you. So hit that like button, hit subscribe, go check out the blog, and I hope to hear from you in the comments, and I will see you again later. Bye!